I've sat behind this bench for more years than I care to count. I've watched thousands of faces pass through those courtroom doors, and if you do this long enough, you start to believe you've seen every version of human behavior there is to see. You've seen the angry ones who walk in ready to fight the world over a parking ticket. You've seen the nervous ones who can barely get their own name out. You've seen the ones who think a courtroom is a place to perform, and the ones who think it's a place to disappear into the background and hope nobody notices them. After enough years, you start to think nothing left in this room can surprise you. You start to believe the human heart has already shown you every trick it has. I was wrong, and I want to tell you about the day that proved it. Before I get into it, let me just say, if the kind of stories that stay with you long after they're over are the kind you're looking for, this is the place for that. Go ahead and hit subscribe now, because I promise you by the end of this one, you'll understand exactly why I still think about it. It started like any other morning. My docket was full the way it always is. Page after page of names, offenses, dates, small infractions that would be forgotten by both sides within a week. Speeding, expired registrations, a missed inspection here, an unpaid fine there. The machinery of a courtroom runs on repetition, and repetition breeds a certain numbness if you're not careful. I've always tried to fight that numbness, because the moment you stop seeing the person behind the paperwork is the moment you've stopped doing this job the right way. But even with that discipline, some mornings blur into others. That morning didn't blur. That morning is carved into my memory the way very few things are. A young woman walked into my courtroom. She couldn't have been more than 19, maybe 20 at the outside. She didn't walk the way most people walk into a courtroom. Most people walk in with some version of armor on, in defensiveness, irritation, a rehearsed explanation they've been practicing in the car on the way over. She had none of that. She walked in like someone who had already been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and this hearing, whatever it turned out to be, was simply one more weight being added to a pile that was already too tall. Her name was Emily. She made her way to the podium and stood there with her hands folded in front of her, the way a child stands when they're trying very hard to be good, to not draw any more attention to themselves than absolutely necessary. Her eyes were down. Not out of disrespect, I could tell that immediately. It was something closer to exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that settles into a person's posture long before it ever reaches their voice. I looked down at the paperwork in front of me. On its face, it was nothing unusual, a registration violation, a citation that had come in the mail for a vehicle that was, according to the record, still registered under two names. Two names that clearly did not belong to the young woman standing in front of me. On paper, this was about as routine as a case could get. Thousands of these move through courtrooms like mine every single month. But something about the way she stood there, something about the stillness in her, told me this was not going to be routine at all. "Miss," I said, glancing back down at the names on the registration, "the vehicle is registered to—" I read them aloud. "Are they able to join us today?" She didn't answer right away. I want to tell you something I've learned after all these years on this bench. Silence in a courtroom is almost never empty. People think silence means nothing is happening, but it's usually the opposite. Silence is usually the sound of someone trying to find words for something they have not yet learned how to say out loud. I've learned to listen to silence just as carefully as I listen to testimony, maybe more carefully, because silence tells you things people haven't figured out how to phrase yet. So I waited. I didn't rush her. I've found that rushing people in moments like that only pushes the truth further away. If you're just finding this channel, this is exactly the kind of moment that keeps me telling these stories. Real people, real courtrooms, real humanity, no scripts, no performances, just what actually happens when ordinary lives intersect with the law. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, go ahead and subscribe right now so you don't miss what happens next. Because what happened next in that room is something I don't think I'll ever forget as long as I live. I asked her again, and this time I made sure my voice was as gentle as I could make it. "Where are your parents, dear?" She lifted her eyes just enough to meet mine. She took a breath, and I watched that breath shake on the way in, the way breath shakes right before someone says something they've been avoiding saying. "They're gone, sir." 4 words. That's all it took. 4 words, and every bit of noise in that room seemed to just empty out. You have to understand something about courtrooms. They are loud places, even in their quiet moments. There's the shuffle of paper, the creak of old benches settling under the weight of people shifting in their seats, the low hum of an air system that's older than half the people in the room, someone's phone buzzing in a pocket they forgot to silence before they walked in. There's always noise, even when no one is speaking, but in that moment, all of it seemed to disappear. I honestly don't know if the room actually went silent or if my own attention simply blocked out everything except her voice. Either way, for a few seconds, there was nothing else in that room except those 4 words and the weight sitting behind them. I leaned forward. I remember doing it without even thinking about it. Some part of you just wants to close the distance when somebody tells you something like that. It's an instinct, I think, not a decision. The body moves toward pain before the mind has even finished processing what it just heard. "Who takes care of you all now?" I asked her. "I do," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't waver this time. "I work part-time. It's hard to manage, but I do it." I sat with that for a moment. 4 younger siblings, a part-time job, a citation in the mail for a car that used to belong to 2 parents who were never coming home again, 6 months since the accident that took them both. And here she was, standing in front of a judge on a Tuesday morning, worried sick about a fine, because that's simply what happens when you are 19 years old and you have suddenly become the only adult left in a family of 5. I didn't say anything for a moment. I'm not ashamed to admit that my eyes were stinging. This job asks you to maintain a certain composure. You have to. The position demands it. And most days I can hold that line without much effort. But there are moments this job never fully prepares you for, no matter how many years you've put in, and that was one of them. Before I keep going, let me just say this again. If you're the kind of person who believes stories like this matter, who believes they deserve to be told and retold and shared with people who need to hear them, do me a favor and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to keeping stories like Emily's traveling to the people who need them most. When I finally spoke again, I wasn't speaking as a judge anymore. I was speaking as a man who has grandchildren of his own, who has tucked children into bed at night and worried about their futures the way any parent or grandparent worries. The robe doesn't change that. If anything, the robe sometimes gets in the way of it, and in that moment I set it aside as best I could. "You remind me of my own granddaughter," I told her. "You're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, and you are still standing. Do you understand how rare that is? Do you understand how much strength that actually takes?" She didn't answer. She just held herself very still, the way people do when they are trying with everything they have not to cry in front of a room full of strangers. "You don't owe this court anything," I continued. "If anything, this court owes you for your courage, for your heart, for showing up every single day for those 4 children when nobody in this world would have blamed you if you had simply fallen apart instead." I dismissed the fine right there, on the spot. No further hearing, no additional paperwork, no more weight placed on a young woman who already had more weight on her than any one person should ever be asked to carry alone. But dismissing a piece of paper felt like it wasn't enough. It never feels like enough in moments like that. The law can wipe away a debt on a piece of paper, but it can't put food on a table or pay a light bill or buy a pair of shoes for a growing child. So before she left that courtroom, I made sure that she and her siblings had a little more support behind them than they had walked in with. Not because any statute required it of me, because I was sitting in a position where I had the ability to help, and I could not in good conscience let her walk out of that room with nothing more than a canceled fine in her hand. If this is the kind of justice you believe in, the kind that leaves room for mercy, the kind that remembers there's a human being standing behind every case number, then subscribe and stay with me, because there is more where this story came from. I have been doing this a long time, and I can tell you honestly, courtrooms do not often erupt into applause. It is not that kind of room, but that day it did. Officers who had stood at the back of that courtroom for years, who I would have told you had grown numb to almost everything a courtroom could show them, had tears on their faces they were not bothering to hide. Clerks who process 100 cases a week without so much as blinking had to look away and collect themselves before they could go back to their paperwork. I wiped my own eyes. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. There is no dignity in pretending a moment like that doesn't reach you. If anything, I think there's more dignity in letting it show. Emily and her siblings walked out of that courtroom differently than they had walked in. I watched it happen, right there in front of me. The young woman who had entered with her eyes fixed on the floor, left with her chin just slightly higher than it had been. Behind her walked 4 younger children, who probably did not fully understand everything that had just happened in that room, but who understood enough. They understood that somebody sitting in a position of power had looked at their older sister and decided out loud in front of everyone that she mattered, that all 5 of them mattered. I have thought about that day more times than I could possibly count in the years since. Not because it carried any legal significance, it didn't. On paper, it was a routine registration case. the kind that gets processed and forgotten 100 times a week in courtrooms across this country, in cities and towns most people will never hear of. It stayed with me because it was significant in a different way entirely. It reminded me, in a single moment, exactly what this job is actually supposed to be for. One more thing before we get to how this story ends. If you've made it this far with me, you clearly care about the kind of stories that remind us what people are capable of, both in hardship and in kindness. Subscribing means the next one finds you the moment it's ready, instead of getting lost in everything else out there competing for your attention. I have thought a great deal over the years about what justice actually means, about what it's supposed to accomplish, and who it's ultimately supposed to serve. Most days, justice looks like fairness in its simplest form, applying the same standard to everyone who walks through that door, regardless of who they are or what circumstances brought them there. That consistency matters. It's the backbone of the entire system, and I would never argue otherwise. But every once in a while, justice looks like something else entirely. It looks like seeing the whole person standing in front of you, not just the citation in your hand. It looks like recognizing that the letter of the law and the actual spirit of decency sometimes point in two very different directions, and having the willingness to choose the direction that genuinely helps a fellow human being get through their day, get through their week, get through whatever impossible season of life they happen to be living through. That is the choice I made that morning. And if you put me back in that same room on that same day with that same young woman standing in front of me, I would make the exact same choice again without a single second of hesitation. The recording of that hearing found its way onto the internet not long after it happened. I will tell you honestly, I never expected it to travel the way that it did. Within days, millions of people had watched a tired old judge lean forward across his own bench and tell a 19-year-old girl that she did not owe anybody in that room a single thing. Comments began pouring in from every corner of the world, people sharing their own stories of loss, their own memories of somebody showing up for them exactly when they needed it most, their own quiet gratitude for a moment they had never expected to see play out in, of all places, a courtroom. One comment in particular has stayed with me ever since, and I think about it often. Someone wrote that the world needs more people like the one they saw in that clip, because sometimes kindness is the truest form of justice there is. I read that comment more than once. I am not sure I fully deserve that kind of praise. I was simply a man who looked at a young woman doing an impossible job without a single complaint and decided the very least I could do, sitting where I was sitting, was make one part of her impossibly hard day a little lighter to carry. There is something about watching someone hold themselves together under circumstances that would break most people that changes how you see your own responsibilities. I have handed down rulings on cases far more complicated than a registration violation. I have made decisions that carried real legal weight, that shaped outcomes in ways that mattered a great deal to the people standing in front of me. But very few of those moments have stayed with me the way that Tuesday morning has stayed with me, because very few of them reminded me so clearly of exactly why any of us choose to do this work in the first place. We do not become judges because we love paperwork. We do not sit behind these benches because we enjoy reading citations aloud to rooms full of strangers. We do it, or at least the best of us do it, because somewhere along the way we believed that the law could be a tool for protecting people, not just punishing them. We believed that a courtroom could be a place where somebody's worst day might, if we are paying close enough attention, become a turning point instead of just another burden. That is what I try to remember every single morning I put this robe on. Not every case allows for that kind of moment. Most days are simply about being fair, being consistent, applying the rules as they are written, and letting the process do what it is designed to do. But every so often, a case walks through that door that asks something more of you. It asks you to look up from the paperwork and actually see the person standing in front of you. It asks you to remember that behind every file number is a whole life, a whole history, a whole set of circumstances that a single sheet of paper could never begin to capture. Emily's file, if you looked at it on paper, told you almost nothing. It told you a name, a date, a citation number, a vehicle registration. It did not tell you that she had buried both of her parents 6 months earlier. It did not tell you that she had gone from being a teenager worrying about ordinary teenage things to being the sole guardian of 4 younger siblings almost overnight. It did not tell you about the part-time job she worked to keep food on a table that used to be set by 2 parents who were no longer there to set it. It did not tell you about the nights she probably spent wondering if she was doing any of this right, if she was failing the people who needed her most, if anyone out there even noticed how hard she was trying. None of that was in the file. All of that was in her eyes when she walked into my courtroom that morning, and in the way her voice shook when she said those 4 words that I don't think I will ever forget. I think about the other people who might have been sitting behind that bench that day. I think about how easy it would have been for anyone in my position to simply process the case the way it was written. Read the citation, apply the standard fine, move on to the next name on the docket. Nobody would have questioned that. Nobody would have called it wrong. It would have been, by every technical measure, entirely correct. But correct is not always the same thing as right. And I have spent enough years in this job to know the difference matters more than people realize. So when I looked at her that morning, when I saw the way she stood there trying so hard to hold herself together, something in me refused to just process the paperwork and move on. I could not look at a 19-year-old girl who had lost both of her parents and taken on the responsibility of raising 4 younger children, all while working a part-time job to keep them fed, and simply tell her she owed the state a fine for a piece of paperwork nobody had gotten around to updating. It felt, in that moment, like the cruelest kind of technicality, punishing someone for the exact circumstances that were already punishing her far more than any fine ever could. I want to be honest with you about something else, too. That moment did not just change how Emily and her siblings walked out of that courtroom. It changed something in me as well. I went home that night and sat with my own family a little differently than I usually did. I found myself watching my own grandchildren with a kind of gratitude I don't think I had fully felt before. Grateful simply that they had parents who were there, that they had a home that wasn't held together by a 19-year-old working part-time and refusing to let her siblings feel the absence of the 2 people who used to hold everything together. It is a strange thing, this job. You spend so many hours listening to other people's worst moments that you sometimes forget how much those moments are quietly teaching you about your own life. Emily taught me something that day without ever meaning to. She taught me that resilience does not always look like strength in the way we usually imagine it. Sometimes resilience looks like a shaking voice and eyes fixed on the floor and hands folded tightly together because they are the only thing keeping a person from falling apart. Sometimes the strongest people in the room are the quietest ones, the ones who walk in trying not to be noticed at all. I think about her often, even now. I think about her siblings, about what their lives look like today, whether they are doing well, whether Emily ever got a chance to put some of that weight down, even just for a little while. I do not know the answers to those questions. I only know what happened in my courtroom on that one Tuesday morning, and I know that it changed something in everyone who was in that room to witness it. The clerks who process 100 cases a week talked about it for days afterward. The officers who stand at the back of that courtroom day after day, watching case after case blur into the next one, told me later that it was the first time in a long while that they had felt something shift in the room, something they could not quite put into words, but knew they would remember for a long time to come. And I think that is really what this whole story comes down to in the end. Not the fine that was waived, not the help that was quietly given, not even the moment itself. It comes down to the fact that in a room built entirely around rules and procedures and technicalities, there was still space for humanity to walk in and remind everyone why those rules exist in the first place. The rules exist to protect people. And every so often, protecting people means setting the rules aside just long enough to actually see them. There is a part of this story I have not told very often, and I think it belongs here because it says something about how far a single moment can travel once it leaves the room where it happened. Weeks later, I received a letter. Not an email, not a comment on some video, an actual letter folded twice, sent through the mail the old-fashioned way. It was from a woman in another state entirely, someone I had never met and never would meet. She wrote that she had watched the clip of that hearing on a night when she had been sitting alone in her kitchen, feeling like she had nothing left to give to anyone, including her own children. She wrote that watching a stranger's courage on a screen had, in her words, given her just enough to get up the next morning and keep going. She thanked me, but I remember thinking as I read it that the thanks did not really belong to me at all. It belonged to Emily. I had simply been the person sitting behind the bench when her courage happened to be witnessed. That is the part of this job nobody really prepares you for. You think, when you put on the robe for the first time, that your influence stops at the walls of the courtroom. You think your decisions matter only to the people standing directly in front of you on any given day. You do not expect that a single exchange, lasting only a few minutes, could travel across an entire country and land in the kitchen of a stranger on a night when she needed it most. But that is exactly what happened, and it happened more than once. Letters kept arriving for months afterward, some from people who had lost parents themselves and saw their own grief reflected back at them, some from older siblings who had taken on responsibility for younger ones under circumstances of their own, circumstances that had nothing to do with a courtroom or a citation, but everything to do with the same quiet exhaustion I had seen in Emily's eyes. Some simply from people who said the story reminded them to call their own mother or father that same night just to hear their voice. I want to pause here and say something directly to whoever is listening to this right now. If any part of what I have described sounds familiar to you, if you are the person carrying more than your share, working harder than anyone around you realizes, showing up every single day for people who depend on you while nobody asks how you are holding up, I see you. Emily's story is not really about a courtroom. It is about every person out there quietly doing the impossible without expecting anyone to notice. And if this story is reaching you today, consider it me noticing, even from a distance, even without knowing your name. Before I bring this to a close, let me say once more, if these stories matter to you, if you find yourself thinking about Emily the same way I still think about her all these years later, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure the next story finds its way to you. It is a small thing to ask, but it is the reason these moments keep reaching new people instead of disappearing after a single afternoon on the internet. I think often about what would have happened if that morning had gone differently. If I had simply read the citation, applied the standard fine, and moved on to the next name on my list the way the job technically allows. Emily would have left that courtroom with one more bill to figure out how to pay, one more weight added to a pile that was already far too tall for a 19-year-old to be carrying alone. Nobody would have known the difference. The docket would have moved along exactly as it was designed to. And a story that ended up reaching millions of people, that ended up sitting with a woman alone in her kitchen on a hard night, that ended up reminding strangers all over the world to hug their families a little tighter would simply never have existed at all. That is what makes this job matter to me, even after all these years. Not the big cases, not the ones that make headlines for their legal complexity. It is the small, quiet moments where you have the choice to simply process a case or to actually see a person, and where choosing the second option turns out to matter more than you could have possibly imagined at the time. I did not know, sitting there that morning, that this particular moment would travel as far as it did. I was not thinking about cameras or clips or comment sections. I was thinking about a young woman standing in front of me who had already lost more than anyone her age should ever have to lose, and about what small thing I could do in that moment to make her load even slightly lighter. That is the story. That is what happened in my courtroom that morning, told exactly the way I remember it, exactly the way it happened. Not a legal ruling that will be studied or cited anywhere, not a precedent that changes how future cases will be decided. Just a single moment where the law took a step back and humanity stepped forward to take its place, if only for a few minutes, in a room that usually has very little space for anything but paperwork and procedure. I have told a lot of stories from behind this bench over the years, and I imagine I will tell a lot more before I am finished. But this one, out of all of them, is the one people ask me about most. This is the one that strangers stop me to talk about. The one that shows up in my inbox from people all over the world who tell me it made them call their own family, made them hug their own children a little tighter that night, made them remember that the world, even with everything wrong in it, still has room for moments like this one. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. If it meant something to you the way it has meant something to me for all these years, do me one favor before you go. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and share it with somebody in your life who might need the reminder today that kindness still exists in this world, that it still shows up in the most unexpected places, sometimes even in a courtroom on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. I will see you in the next story.